I grew up in a holler just outside of Swords Creek, West Virginia, where the hills cradle you like a mother but don't do a thing to take care of you. Our town wasn't much. One gas station, a post office, and a church that doubled as the town's social center. It was the kind of place where kids played in the woods until dusk, and adults gathered for potlucks every Sunday after service. Normal. At least as normal as life could be out here. But boy, did people talk. There were stories about lights in the sky, strange creatures lurking by the creek, old curses tied to the coal mines. None of it ever amounted to anything real though. Just to talk and keep the cold nights interesting. That's what I continue to tell myself anyway. Something to keep us kids in line out there. Of all the oddities about my childhood, the baptisms were what stuck with me the most. They weren't strange to anybody else, but my family and friends treated them like another rite of passage, as natural as learning to fish or gut a deer, but to me, they always felt off. Swords Creek wasn't just some lazy little stream either. Its waters churned with ancient anger. When the church had baptisms, the congregation would line up along the banks, singing hymns that sounded louder, harsher against the rush of that water. I watched my younger brother get dunked there, his skinny arms flailing as our pastor held him down longer than I thought was necessary. My aunt called it the Holy Spirit moving throughout him, but it looked a lot more like fear to me. My mom and dad told me that I was baptized down there too, but I personally don't remember it. By the time my cousin Hannah, her turn came, I thought I was numb to the strangeness of it all, but I was wrong. Her baptism was very different. It wasn't just about religion or tradition. It was something else entirely. I remember that Sunday like a stain in my head. It started out just like any other. The air smelled of rain-soaked woodland. The fog hugged the hills so tightly you could barely even see the tops. We gathered up in the church, its clapboard walls groaning as the pews filled with the usual faces, except for a few that I did not recognize. The strangers sat in the back, their eyes scanning the room like they were cataloging us. They didn't sing or bow their heads during opening prayer. Just sat there with these blank, heavy stares. Something about them set my teeth on edge, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Then the service started, and that's when I knew something was very off. The hymns were not the ones that we always sang. These were harsher, more guttural. The sermon wasn't the usual soft-spoken call to love thy neighbor. Pastor Bill was practically shouting, his voice cracking as he paced back and forth. He spoke about sin like it was a sickness eating at our insides. His words were cutting sharper than I'd ever heard before. When the sermon ended, a murmur then went throughout the congregation as the older members, Pastor Bill, the deacons, even my dad, stood up and then disappeared into a back room. They returned moments later, dressed in these long white robes with tall pointed hoods. I'd never seen those robes before, and it didn't sit right with me. They looked far too clean, too ceremonial, and far too strange for this little mountain church. Hannah, bless her heart, was only 10. She didn't understand what was happening any more than I did. She sat between her parents, her small hands twisting nervously in her lap. When Pastor Bill called her name, she flinched like a startled bird. We all rose then, the entire congregation, and followed them out the door and down at the creek. The air felt heavy, like a storm was brewing, even though the sky around us was clear. My gut told me to turn back, but I couldn't. I didn't. I had to see what was going to happen. That creek was louder than I ever remember it being. Its roar was drowning out the soft murmurs of all the congregation as we all lined up near the bank. The strangers from the church were hanging back, watching everything with those dead eyes. Pastor Bill and the men in white robes waded off into the water, their movements slow, deliberate, like they were trying not to disturb something lurking below the surface. Hannah was clutching her mother's hand. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the swirling water. I felt a pang of guilt for not stepping in, for not telling her parents that this whole thing felt wrong to me. But what could I say? To everybody else, this was sacred, God's work. But to me, it felt like we were trespassing. When they reached the center of the creek, Pastor Bill raised his hand and began to sing. Only, it wasn't a hymn, or not any hymn I'd ever heard before. His voice was twisted into a chant. The words were guttural and strange. Then the other men joined in, their voices clashing, overlapping until it sounded less like music and more like a ritual. Hannah's mom then nudged her toward the water, her face soft but insistent. Hannah shook her head. Her lip was trembling. Her mother whispered something that I couldn't hear, and Hannah stepped forward. I could see the tears already welling up in her eyes. As she waded in, the current was pulling at her legs. The congregation began humming along with the chant. It was low, deep, almost like a growl. I turned to my dad, hoping that he'd notice how wrong this was, but he just stood there, eyes glassy, lips moving, as if he was mouthing along all the words with the others. All the adults looked the same, entranced, like puppets on a string. Hannah was shaking as the men took her arms, each one holding her like she might bolt at any second. Pastor Bill then placed a hand on her forehead, his chanting growing louder, louder, and louder until he pushed her under. At first, it was normal, like any other time. Baptisms always kind of look a little rough, people thrashing, water flying everywhere. But as the seconds ticked by, Hannah's arms started flailing, and it was clear this wasn't right or normal. She was fighting. Her legs were kicking wildly. Her head was twisting against the pastor's grip. They were holding her under for far too long. "Stop it!" I shouted, my voice cracking, but nobody even turned and looked at me. It was like I didn't exist. I stepped forward, my boots sinking into the muddy bank. "She's gonna drown!" I screamed, but the chanting grew louder, drowning me out. Hannah broke the surface for a moment, gasping and coughing, but before she could actually catch her breath, he shoved her back under. Her eyes found mine for a split second, wide, pleading. I'll never forget the look on her face. It wasn't even fear anymore. It was just pure despair. I grabbed a rock from the ground, rough, jagged, and hurled it at the men in the water. It missed, splashing harmlessly near their feet, but it was enough to make them hesitate. Before I could grab another, I heard voices, shouting, laughing, coming from upstream. I turned and saw them, a group of people floating down the creek on inner tubes, a bizarre contrast to the chaos that was unfolding before me. They had coolers tied to their rafts, cans of beer in their hand, and a speaker blaring some country music. At first, I assumed they would just float right by, oblivious, but as they got closer, they noticed the scene. The music cut off, their laughter turned into nervous chuckles, and one of them, a man with a sunburnt face, called out, "The hell are y'all doing? Some kind of cult thing?" The tension snapped like a rubber band. The chanting stopped, the men in the water turned and looked at the intruders, their faces unreadable under the shadows of their hoods. "Y'all need to take your Jesus party somewhere else," the man on the raft said, tossing an empty beer can toward the congregation. It landed with a hollow thunk on the shore. That seemed to break the spell. The congregation began to murmur, shifting uncomfortably. The men inside the water brought Hannah up and guided her back to the bank. Their movements were stiff, robotic. She was coughing, her small body trembling as her parents wrapped her up in a towel. The floaters kept jeering, throwing bits of trash and laughing. I hated them for it, but at the same time, I was very grateful. They seemingly disrupted whatever was happening, shattering that eerie rhythm of the ritual. Pastor Bill didn't say a word as he climbed out of the water, his white robe clinging to his body. He just looked over at the floaters, then at the congregation, and finally at me. His eyes lingered on mine, dark and empty. Before he turned and walked back toward the church, his eyes lingered on mine, dark and empty, before he turned around and walked back toward the church. The strangers from church disappeared after the baptism, loading up into a pair of muddy trucks that rumbled down the dirt road, and now out of sight. Never saw them again either. They were definitely not from around here, that much was clear. I asked my dad later who they were, but he just muttered something about visiting missionaries and then changed the subject almost immediately. That night I lay there in bed, trying to piece it all together, the chanting, the way adults seemed entranced, the eerie timing of the river floaters, and none of it made any kind of sense. It felt like I'd stumbled into something ancient, something I was never supposed to see. Hannah didn't come back to school for almost a week after that, and when she finally returned, she was a lot quieter, a lot more withdrawn. Her usual spark was now gone, replaced by skittishness that made her jump at loud noises or sudden movements. She wouldn't talk to me about the baptism, no matter how much I pressed her. A few months later, her and her parents ended up moving away. They said it was for work, but I overheard my mom whispering to my aunt that Hannah had started having episodes, needed some kind of special care. Didn't sound right to me. Hannah had literally always been the healthiest kid that I knew. The baptisms over at Swords Creek continued, but they were never the same. The robes and that chanting were gone, replaced by the familiar hymns and gentle sermons of my childhood, but I refused to go. I stopped attending. Every time I heard the creeks roar, I would see Hannah's terrified face in my mind and felt the weight of Pastor Bill's gaze. Years later, long after I'd left West Virginia, I stumbled across this old photo of our church congregation. It was tucked into a box of keepsakes my mom had sent me after she downsized. In the picture, everybody was smiling. Everybody except for the strangers that day. They stood at the edge of the group, their faces hard and blank. Something about the photo made my skin crawl. I flipped it over, hoping for some kind of explanation, and only found a single word scrawled in faded ink. Witnesses. I called my mom that night, photo still in hand. Asked her if she remembered those people, the one who'd worn the robes and chanted in the creek. There was this long pause on the line before she finally spoke.
You know, I don't recall. I don't remember at all.
And that part really creeped me out, but what more could I do? It was now just a memory, something weird, and memories are a hard thing to trust. My resources were pretty much exhausted, so I didn't pursue it further. Plus, I don't think I really wanted to know. Something about the whole thing just gave me the creeps, and I was content to just let it be a weird thing in the back of my mind. And to this day, folks are still baptized in those waters. I grew up in southern West Virginia. If you've never been out in those mountains at night, it's hard to explain the kind of darkness that actually lives there. It isn't just the absence of light, it's heavy, primordial. The woods swallow everything up. The footsteps, the road noise between towns, even the sky sometimes. Once the sun drops behind those ridges, the forest becomes its own world. People from outside think they understand the woods because they've gone camping or hiked a state park trail during the day or something, but the woods in Appalachia after midnight feel very different, ancient, like something has been there long before you arrive and doesn't like to see other visitors. My story takes place about 2 or 3 years ago. My buddy Mark was over at my place one night. We'd been doing what we usually do, watching UFC fights, talking trash over Xbox, eating whatever the hell junk food that we could find in the kitchen. This was a classic pastime stuff for me back then, eating Twinkies, drinking beer, shadowboxing at the TV while people got knocked out cold. By the time we realized how late it got, it was well past midnight. The fights were over, the house was quiet, and we both had that wired, restless feeling that comes from a high-energy kind of night. Mark suggested that we go for a walk. There's a trail not far from my house that cuts through a dense patch of woods. Nothing special, just a narrow dirt path that people use during the day to walk their dogs or get a little bit of exercise. But once the sun goes down, hardly anybody goes out there. Not because anything has ever officially happened, it's just one of those places, you know? A dark, isolated trail through the woods. Bad area for an accident or an animal attack. We figured we'd walk out there, smoke a joint, burn off into exhaustion. Living where I lived, being young, all pumped up, we didn't really give it a second thought. We owned the area between our houses. Not in a legal sense, more like caveman kind of rights. The entrance to the trail is only a few minutes from my place, but once you step off into those trees, the road disappears really quickly. The canopy is thick, and the deeper you go, the darker it actually gets. The canopy is thick, and the deeper you go, the darker it gets. Our phone light barely even cut through it. Every few steps, dry branches would crack off like gunfire under your shoes, and the sound would echo in every direction. I felt like a dumbass for not bringing an actual flashlight. I'd say around 30 minutes later, we reached this spot that we could chill in. There's a stretch where the trees open just enough that the trail widens up on both sides, so we just stopped there. Mark pulls out the weed and the papers and rolled up while we were talking about the fights and whatever dumb stuff that had been going on that week. The whole time around us, the forest was alive with noise, and I mean alive. Crickets, frogs, things rustling through the leaves, branches snapping somewhere deeper in the brush, and scratching up against the tree bark. You hear that kind of thing in the woods all the time, but at night, it really felt crowded. Almost like every animal in the forest was up and active, which was super weird. I mentioned it to Mark. He just shrugged though, said something like, probably a raccoon or deer spook and everything. At the time, I just kind of agreed with him. Didn't seem like that big of a deal. We finished the joint, flicked the roach into the dirt, and started walking back the way we came. I think we took maybe 10 steps when the forest just went completely silent. It wasn't subtle. It didn't taper. It was as if somebody just pulled out the remote control, hit the mute button on everything around us. What had just been ripe, rich chatter between critters was cut off, as if it had never been there at all. If you spend time in the woods, you know how strange that feels. Mark stopped walking beside me. "So that's weird," he said. But before I could answer him back, we heard the voice. It came from somewhere behind us in the trees, and at first we both assumed it was a person, but the sound had this human shape to it, but the longer it went on, the less sense it actually really made. The voice was deep and very, very distorted. The closest thing I can compare it to is one of those cheap children's toys with the dying battery. The kind with that little speaker that crackles and warps the words. It had that same robotic wobble to it. Pitch would rise and then fall in these unnatural tones. Something was trying to imitate speech without understanding how it worked. It was talking or trying to. The sounds didn't form words that I could understand, just this shaky, broken string of noises. I remember I wanted to move, but every muscle in my body was frozen, petrified from top to bottom, as if I was under some kind of spell. Mark looked over at me with horror in his eyes, and I could see the same thought forming in his head that was in mine. We shouldn't be here. We turned slowly and started making our way back. Now, I could have broken on, left his ass in the dust, but I was too scared. What if I get ahead? Whatever this thing is nabs one of us. What if we get separated? Lots of creepy thoughts kept me going the same speed as Mark. At first, we just kept it at this fast walk, but the voice kept going. The moment we moved, it continued behind us in the exact same tone and volume, matching us step by step. It never faded, but it also never got any closer either, just staying there continuously. It felt like it was mocking us, but regardless, I started to sweat really bad under my clothes. I think maybe 20 seconds went by, and we just started sprinting. Branches whipped our arms as we tore down the trail, our phone lights bouncing everywhere. My lungs started burning almost immediately, but neither of us slowed down because how could we? We were stoned. We had no idea what we were dealing with, and the thought of slowing down meant certain death. The voice followed us the entire time. Same volume, same distance, like it was glued to us. But we could never understand a single syllable. No matter how fast we ran or how long we ran, that warped, broken voice just kept repeating those strange sounds directly behind us. That was the moment real fear set in. Not the nervous kind that you get when you're spooking yourself in the woods with your friends. I mean, the kind of fear that hits your gut, tells you something is deeply wrong. The uncanny valley or whatever it was called. I could hear the voice, but I couldn't hear the footfalls, thrashing leaves. Nothing to indicate movement. Was this thing floating in the fucking air behind us? Was it purely just some kind of disembodied voice? I was spiraling. We were in danger, and I remember thinking that very clearly. I don't remember how long we ran for. It felt like forever, but was probably only a few minutes. Finally, we saw the faint glow from the road ahead through the trees. The trail exit and my house just beyond it. We stumbled off into the gravel clearing, both of us bent over trying to catch our breath. Felt like daggers in my lungs after that joint. The woods behind us were quiet again, though for about 5 seconds. Then whatever the hell it was, screamed. The sound exploded out of the trees behind us like something straight from hell. Not far down that trail, right there on top of us. I've lived in these mountains my entire life. I know what all the animals sound like. Coyotes, foxes, bobcats, even mountain lions. People online love to say those screams that you hear are animals. I'm telling you right now, that was not an animal. It sounded human, but filled with agony and scorn. That's all I can really describe it as. It nearly made my ears bleed. Mark actually dropped to his knees. Birds burst out of the trees overhead in panic, wings flapping in every direction, suddenly startled awake by that sudden intrusion. And for another minute or so, neither of us moved. until we kind of caught ourselves and started running again. My house was only a couple of minutes down the road and we made it there in record time. I don't remember talking about anything, but I remember locking the doors and getting a pair of golf clubs from the closet, something to put us at ease. My hands were shaking so badly every time I gripped that handle. We spoke about it a little bit, but every time we did, we'd hear a rustle outside or a creak on the porch. We thought it was listening, so we stayed quiet and just watched fucking shit on TV. Eventually, we both passed out in the living room, woke up alive in the morning, and that was that. I walked Mark out to his car. He buzzed home, and we never stepped on that trail again. In the years since, I've only told maybe 3 people about that night. Most of them, of course, laugh it off or say it was in fact an animal making those weird noises. Maybe, but I was there. Mark was there. We know what happened. I've spent my whole life in these woods, and I've never heard anything like that before. Not on a hike, not on a hunt, not on a fucking camping trip. And thank God I've never heard it since.